All right, next up, we've got Mark Fancher. Hey, Mark.
Hey, how are you? Thanks for having me again.
Good to see you. So tell us a little bit about yourself.
I'm a senior motion designer at a place called Already Been Chewed, and we do mostly like motion graphics for products. Lots of shoes, watches, sunglasses, regular glasses, sports-related apparel, stuff like that. And so I do most of the Houdini work over there. We're starting to bring on some more Houdini people, so it's been really cool to watch that part of our team grow. And in addition to that, I also teach the Stop Being Afraid of Houdini course with Mograph.com. And so I do have a love of sort of connecting with other people and helping them learn how to do cool stuff in this software.
Excellent. Very much needed.
Yeah.
So what are you going to be talking about today?
So today, I put together a little presentation on a couple techniques that we used recently in production, and I like to call them Mograph liquids because they're used in a Mography sense. They're more stylized than a true traditional fluid simulation. They sort of lean pretty heavily on the VDB toolset and just kind of fancy ways of, working with geometry and sending it through volume building to kind of create these stylized liquids that aren't necessarily actually simulated liquid behavior, but they sort of look like liquids in the way that they behave. So I thought it'd be kind of a fun thing to just show some SOPs approaches to generating liquid-like behavior.
Very cool. Well, let's jump in.
Cool. Hello, everybody. My name is Mark Fancher, and I'm here with a presentation on Mograph liquids. So Mograph liquids are, I call them Mograph liquids because they're not really simulated. They're actually just leaning pretty heavily on volume building in Houdini to create liquid-like behavior, but just it's all in SOPs. There's no simulation whatsoever. So it's sort of more of a stylized approach to creating liquid-like behavior, and I'll be going over a couple examples of that in a bit. First, I'll give you a little bit of my background. I am a senior motion designer at Already Been Chewed. I do mostly Houdini work there, but a little bit of C4D and a little bit of After Effects as well. I'm also the teacher of the Stop Being Afraid of Houdini course on Mograph.com. It is geared towards kind of creating, bringing people who are more comfortable with Cinema 4D into the world of Houdini for motion design. I'm a self-taught generalist with a very wide-ranging background that eventually led me to Houdini, where I have been full-time in Houdini for the past 4 years. And here's a look at my reel. So yeah, most of those clips were actually clips from my work, and then I took for one personal project at the very end there. But at Already Been Chewed, we are a motion design studio based out of Dallas, Texas, and we do a lot of product launches in promo graphics and sports apparel brands, New Balance, shoes, watches, etc. So we are a team of generalist specialists. So while we're all kind of capable of doing a little bit of everything, we all also do have an area that we focus on. For example, I focus on Houdini, but I can do a little bit of C4D and After Effects. Our producers mostly produce, but they can hop in and do look dev in Cinema 4D if we need help with that. So it is a kind of a nimble approach, and it's it leads to a sort of collaborative and fun environment where we're all kind of wearing multiple hats, but we all kind of focus and bounce ideas off each other and get creative with our projects. So it's really cool. This is the space, kind of a cool creative space. You can see we've got graffiti everywhere, bricks, wood, a basketball hoop, and it was all kind of put together by my boss up here in the corner, Barton Damer, who is the the founding creative behind Already Been Chewed itself. And here's a look at the Already Been Chewed reel. Cool. So the first effect I want to go over is the liquid formation effect we did for Persol. Persol is a company that makes sunglasses, and let's just take a look at some of the clips from that project. So here's the universe spot. Cool. And then the next spot that we worked on was a lens formation spot. So let's take a look at that. And now there isn't really a liquid formation effect going on here, but one thing that I love to do whenever I get the chance is do a side-by-side of these velocity fields along with the particle systems that they drive. Because I always think that's kind of interesting look behind the scenes to see, you know, how the velocity field is built and what the final motion of the particles looks like after the fact. So you can kind of get a little bit of a preview of that. Just a little tangent, but back to the next spot, which is the calligrapher spot, which is the spot where we did the liquid formation technique. Now, this first liquid formation actually is a simulation. We used the suction force. We did flip fluids with the suction force to kind of get the first part of this to form, but then after the first formation occurs, we move into a Sop setup where it is this sort of Mograph liquids that I'm talking about. So you can take a look at that here. Cool. So yeah, the effect that we're really talking about is what you can kind of see here. It's, you know, we've got the bridge of the glasses, we've got all these different materials, and we needed to kind of bring them on in a liquid-like way. So what we essentially did was come up with a volume building technique, which kind of brings them on in a wobbly kind of, I don't know how to describe it, stylized liquid looking effect. So I'll give a little bit of a demo of that right now in Houdini. So let's hop over there. All right, so this is the setup for that. Now we wedged through each different material in the object. So we did, you know, the frames separately from the lenses, separately from the bridge, etc. But more or less it occurs in three main sections. So we first create some base motion, a little bit of a wobble or a jiggle that kind of makes it feel like it's liquidy and it's kind of undulating around. Then we do sort of an intersection, sort of a SDF Boolean operation. And then we use sort of the boundaries of that SDF Boolean operation to create a mask for our smoothing of the SDF. So let's start off with checking out what we did to get the base motion. So essentially what I do is I'll just remesh the lenses so that we get this triangular pattern, because I'm going to pass a transition attribute through it. And I find that it works better if this is a little bit more random than perfectly quadded topology. Next thing I'll do is kind of choose a starting point for the transition. So I'll roughly place a sphere out in space near where I want it to start, and then ray it onto the geometry, and then use that position, that sphere as a bounding object for our starting points, which are fed into this transition asset that I built. I feel like I feel like building a nice transition attribute for yourself is a good rite of passage as a Houdini person. So I'd recommend anyone go ahead and do that. But you can see more or less over this time frame, we are creating this transition attribute that is going from 0 to 1 and effectively acting as our mask for this effect to grow on. So you can see it kind of going from blue to pink. That is this ramp right here, ramping on as the transition attribute grows from those points over that we grouped as our starting points across the rest of the frame. So then the next thing that I do is I transfer those attributes back onto the original topology so that it's nice and high res. And then I blur the attributes out a little bit, which you can't really see in the color here because it's just a little bit hard to see as color. But when it comes to mixing positions together, it is kind of handy to have these extra smooth and blurred out transition attributes across our points. So the next step here is to create sort of a wobbly like behavior. So if I kind of play this back, you can kind of see that it's got this sort of undulation like liquid might have if it was suspended in air. And then to get it to land, we just put it into a point wrangle here where we just look up the position of the static frame, and then we mix it with the position of the wobbling frame based off of that transition attribute. So if I scrub through this, you can kind of see it landing there. I'm just going to switch back to my presentation to get a closer look at that. So here you can kind of see the geometry sort of landing into place as that attribute passes through. It kind of goes from wobbly to landing into its final position like so. But that looks very regular. So what we wanted to do was actually apply a little bit of wobbly behavior to it. So the way I do that is I send it through an asset I created called a spring solver. And essentially what that does is let's just hide that. What that does is it adds a little bit of jiggly behavior to it, to the motion. So instead of it coming to a dead stop, it kind of jiggles a little bit. Now I went over how to make this spring solver in my last Hive talk from about a year ago. So you can, that should be on the Side Effects YouTube channel or something like that. But if you want more detail about that, yeah, basically the spring solver just allows things to jiggle around a little bit instead of landing solidly. So the way that looks is like so. So you can see instead of it landing super hard, it kind of has this nice like little extra undulation to it as it's sort of getting to its final resting position. But then once it does stop jiggling, it is really fully resolved in that perfect sort of position of that frame. Cool. So the next thing we do is we then take this wobbly sort of behavior that we've created and we want to kind of Boolean that off. And the way we're going to do it is convert it into an SDF and do an intersection with our original geometry. But what we need to do is we need to actually, sorry, I misspoke. What we need to do is actually create sort of geometry based off of where this fall off is happening to cut our lens apart and only reveal what has been transitioned to along this attribute. So the way I do that is we take our input mesh again here and we just I just turned it into a density, VDB density, and then scattered points throughout it. So now that I have these points, I can actually assign a particle scale based off of that transition attribute. So I transfer that transition attribute back onto the particles, and then use this little wrangle here to control the P scale based off of that transition attribute and kind of ramp it on. So if we take a look at these sprites, you can kind of see how that looks. You see that as that transition attribute passes through, those points kind of grow on. And if I were to do an intersection on this, it would reveal where the glasses are starting to form. And just to make sure that these points are moving along with our geometry, I add a little bit of a, I use a point deform to get that same jiggly behavior from our previous wobble onto this particle reveal that we're doing here. So the next step in that is to do a VDB from particles. And so you can kind of see that forming here. VDB from particles kind of is bringing on that shape. But one thing that we don't really want to do a Boolean, an SDF intersection with this yet, just because the ends of it are kind of particly still. They're kind of broken up, and we kind of want to have a nice hard edge here. So what we do is we smooth that off. So you can kind of see that here. If I play this back, you can kind of see that we get this smoothed SDF to cut our geo out, and it's already starting to look pretty liquidy with that. Cool. So then the next thing that we do is we convert our original wobbling geometry like this into an SDF, and then we do a VDB combine on those. So if we get those combined together, you can see them, they kind of looks like this. So it's starting to look more liquidy by the moment, but you can see here what we've got is it sort of looks like a hard edge here. It does look very Boolean-y still, because you can kind of see where that the edge of where that intersection is here. So what we want to do is actually provide a little bit of additional smoothing, but localize it to the area where this sort of Boolean edge is appearing. And so we get a mask. We can apply a mask to our VDBs in a similar way. We can create our mask for our VDBs using a similar technique to what we did up here when we created our intersection surface in the first place. So what I did was I brought in the geo that we used to create the transition attribute. And then I used it to create a density attribute and a P-scale attribute. But instead of the P-scale attribute increasing with this transition, now we're going to decrease it. So you can see that with these ramps right here. And so when I scatter points on that, you can see them kind of disappearing as they go across. That means they're basically just shrinking down to 0 and then being deleted. And if we do a sprite, if I show the sprites on that, you can see we've got very much larger particles here, and that's because I want to have more of a taper between the smoothed and unsmoothed parts of that VDB. So then what we do is VDB from particles like so, and that kind of gives us that the area where our this is the SDF where the smoothing is going to occur, and then I just convert that into a SDF into a fog. And then in this volume wrangle right here, what I do is I actually am just looking up its position in the SDF to add further fading around the edges. So if I were to kind of turn that off, you can see that it's kind of hard to see, but this is a little bit higher contrast. But when we look up the position of the density, so it's gradually the further inside that this original SDF we go, the higher the density and the more the masking is occurring. And that gives us a nice little feather over here when we apply this as a mask. So I did a little bit of a time delay. So it's just kind of lagging behind our original reveal just a little bit. And then I'm applying a reshape and a smooth. So what the reshape does, you can see here, I'm actually enlarging the regions that are being masked off slightly just so that they don't get smoothed away. If you smooth things too much, they sort of just disappear. So I wanted to add a little bit of volume around this leading edge so that it didn't disappear as quickly. And then I apply the smoothing to it. So if I turn that on, you can see that we get this sort of kind of, these edges sort of look liquidy in that way. So if I turn off that reshape, you can kind of see that it gets really pointy and we don't have as much of a gradation. up there and up there. It actually kind of works pretty good up there, but in other areas you kind of want that, because see how this gets broken apart right here. So if we add the little reshape, it does allow this to kind of remain intact and look liquidy a little bit longer before it lands in its final resting shape. And then we convert that back into a polygon, and we are left with sort of that transition. So let's go take a look at that. That's going to be over here. This is the final deformation. You can kind of see it building on in a liquidy way over here, and then it sort of resolves, jiggles, and lands in its final state. So yeah, that's kind of how that works. The one downside of it is that this demo is a pretty low resolution version of this, just so that we can kind of get through the demo. Okay. But, you know, in production, I actually had to do this at a pretty high resolution. So that can be kind of a tricky thing to deal with. Definitely takes a lot of resources, but certainly very flexible in the end. Let's take a look at that spot one more time just to see it in action. All right, and for the last section, I wanted to go over this liquid extrusion effect that we did for a company called Training Mask. Training Mask makes these masks that you wear while you're exercising that somewhat restrict the flow of oxygen to help you like improve your lung capacity and stuff. And with COVID, they created a version that had like extra filtration on the mask that, you know, would sort of protect you from, you know, COVID or viruses or something. So let's just take a look at that spot. Cool. So you can see we had a bunch of cool effects that we did in there. We had this liquid extrusion, and you had this water droplet with surface tension evaporating into particles, and a weave shot. And if you had asked me which shot I thought would be the most complicated, it would have been any of the ones except for the one that was the hardest. I would have thought maybe the weave would have been harder, or that the water droplet would have been harder, but really it ended up being this one, because the challenge was kind of getting this sort of liquid-like behavior, but also having these really hard, chiseled edges around the geometry. So let's just take a closer look. This is sort of a lower res render, but I kind of bumped the lighting up just to get a better view of what the effect is actually doing. So you can see here that we're pulling it out of this liquid, and it kind of gets this nice tapered edge around the bottom. This is sort of replicating an extrusion technique that you would see in 3D printing, but it also still gets us these nice hard edges around the geo. Again, like the last example, this had to be done at pretty high res, so there is that to consider when working with super high res VDBs, is it can be pretty resource intensive, but it ended up working for us. So a little bit of background, here's the inspiration for that kind of a thing. It's a resin extrusion process, so it's sort of a pool of liquid that a laser kind of burns little the laser kind of shoots up the bottom of it, I think, and kind of causes it to harden. But as it's pulling the object out of the liquid, you sort of get these nice kind of like curved edges, as if, something was being pulled out of a super viscous liquid with a lot of surface tension. Cool. So initially, I was working with this and trying to make a simulated version of it, and the simulated version looked pretty cool. I really liked how these little holes and pockets kind of opened up, but what we ended up with was, with all the smoothing that needed to be done with it, these edges around the grate ended up being super curved and not having very much definition. So I thought to myself, could we just not sim it and come up with maybe a way to do this with smoothing VDBs, kind of like how we did in the last spot? And that's where I remembered this document that I found on the internet from Sony ImageWorks And it's this ImageWorks library level sets in production Spider-Man 3.pdf file. And I'd seen this a bunch of times, and I looked at it and kind of had my mind blown by it. But basically, this document, and you can find it on the internet, it's more or less how to be using level sets in production to create these kinds of weird smoothing effects using SDFs. And we have SDFs in Houdini. That would be, our VDB tool set and stuff like that. But basically the effect that they used was, the effects they used this for was for the Sandman. They have cool sequences involving the Sandman intersecting with piles of sand. And instead of just having the geometry intersect, they wanted to have sort of a smoother transition. So this geometry blending section of this paper here, they talk about, having your Sandman geometry and your pile of sand geometry, and how they can kind of get a nice smooth transition by using this formula right here. So the way this formula transfers over to Vex, it kind of looks like this. Basically, what we want to do is we want to take what right here, this says the max of A and B, and you can see that in the C. We're solving for C. We want to take the max of A and B, which is essentially a union of the two volumes. We already have a union operation in our VDB, so I just sort of left that out of my final equation here. But so I use the union of the VDB toolset, but then I applied this formula here. We want to actually create m raised to the beta times gamma. So m is this big old thing right here. And basically what we're doing is we're taking this alpha factor, which is the filleting distance, and B is the blending curve exponential, and gamma is the size of the extrusion in the blending area. And I don't really know what all that, I don't know really what all of those variables stand for, but I just plugged it in into these equations right here. I just kind of copied what they had going on here and plugged it all in and started messing with the sliders and seeing if I could get an effect similar to what we had. Through trial and error, I did have to do something like this, which is instead of adding here, I did use a subtraction, and I'm not using absolute values on these little variables right here. And the reason is, I think, due to the fact that SDFs maybe that they were using are measuring positive values on the outside of the surface and negative, or positive values on the inside of the surface and negative values on the outside of the surface, whereas the VDB toolset is opposite. It's positive values on the outside of the surface and negative values on the inside of the surface. So it was sort of a trial and error for me, but I came to this sort of conclusion, at least in a sense that it worked for me. I'm not sure if it's 100% right, but it ended up working. So that's kind of what you do sometimes. So let's take a look at a demo of that in Houdini. I'm gonna hop over to this one right here. So here's a really basic setup of the basic version of this. We've got our geometry A, which is this box, and our geometry B, which is this tube. And basically what I do is I convert both of them into an SDF like so. But I'm giving them a decent amount of exterior band voxels, and we need the extra exterior band voxels to be able to say, how basically to cover the regions that are going to be filleted. So then what I do is I take a union of those two, and then I create a blank VDB and use the union of these two to activate that region inside the VDB. Then using this activated region that I've created, I use that then to further increase the activation region of our original SDF. So you can see that A has its region activated larger, and B as well has its region activated from just a little bit around it to a much larger space. Now, I'm not sure if that step was necessary, but I just did it anyways because in the troubleshooting process, it was just one of those things that I came to. And then all of those get fed into this volume wrangle, and this is the same volume wrangle that we were just looking at in the previous slide. And you can see here that when we convert that back into a regular without the volume wrangle, it just sort of intersects. And with the volume wrangle, you get this sort of nice taper here. And if I just mess around with the values, you can kind of see if I go beyond a certain point with the alpha value, it does just start dilating. And I think that's because I would just need to increase my exterior band voxels if I wanted to make that go further. But I can kind of increase the distance of that extrusion. And also, I don't know, this is where it gets confusing for me because beta almost seems like it's doing the same thing. But I think gamma actually is controlling the curvature of that. So if you go to super high values of gamma, you can actually get it to bulge outward and like so. So let me just crank beta back up to 10. And yeah, you can see it's kind of more of a hill at that point. So we're actually able to get sort of more of a, different kind of shapes at these intersections depending on values that you want to use. So, for me, if I just switch this over to maybe a torus, you can kind of see we get a different effect here. But for values that worked for me, I think I had this at 1, 10, and 5. Yeah, we kind of get like a little bit more of just a nice little taper between the two objects. And you might be able to think like, oh, I could probably do that using like smoothing or something. I think I initially tried to do it using smoothing. But if you're going to be doing a combination operation and then smoothing on all of your geometry, you do kind of degrade the actual rest of the geometry. Now you could localize this using masks, kind of like how I did in the previous example. And I think that I might have tried that at one point, but knowing that this solution was out there and I had to figure out a way to do it, I ended up just going that route for the final project. Cool. So that's how that works. And then now let's just take a look at a little bit of a behind the scenes of the training mask spot to wrap things up. And that is all I got for this presentation. Thank you so much for watching and happy Houdiniing, everybody. I hope to see you again soon.